know that this meeting will be recorded. So please do go on, turn your camera off or change your name if you don't want to be appearing on the recording. Yeah, thank you very much to everyone. If you could put yourself on mute as well, please. Thank you very much. That's great. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along to this event. This is the first of 3 workshops that we're running in November. We'll share some more details about the ones that are coming up at the end. But this one is called What's Next for Climate Action in Scotland. And my name is Becky Kenton-Lake. I work at Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. We're Scotland's climate coalition. We have over 70 members who campaign together on climate action and justice. And we're really pleased to be working with the Scottish Communities Climate Action Network, SCCAN, who we're co-hosting with, and they have over 400 groups leading on community-led climate action in Scotland. So yeah, really pleased to have you all with us today for this important topic. If you could go to the next slide, please, Joanna. So we've got 4 brilliant speakers covering what needs to happen next on particular emissions reductions in particular sectors in Scotland. I will introduce them slightly later on. But first, I'm going to give you a quick history of what's happened both in the last few years and the last few months, just to bring everyone up to speed with that. So firstly, a brief history. So in 2019, following years of campaigning by both us, many of you I'm sure, and lots of other groups, the Scottish Parliament agreed to set legal targets to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2045 compared to the 1990 baseline. And they set annual interim targets to meet along the way. So we warmly welcome these at the time. They were the right targets to set based on our historic contributions and Scotland being a wealthy country needing to go further than others. And these were world leading at the time. They were the net zero targets 5 years ahead of the UK's targets. So these were these are rightly ambitious targets. I think it's important to say that we recognise the targets, they were always challenging. The government's official advisors said that themselves, but they were achievable. I think it's the government's advisors said that with early action in the right sectors, they would be able to achieve them. But importantly, there is a statement of political intent as well, and it set a high ambition, which was the right thing to do based on the science and our responsibility towards addressing the climate crisis. Next slide, please, Joanna. So what's happened since those targets were set? So Scotland has now missed 5 of its last 6 annual emission reduction targets. And as of 2022, our emissions have reduced by just over 50% since 1990, which is 3.8% off the target that was set for 2022. So 3.8% might not sound like too much, but actually that is the equivalent of kind of the total emissions from all buildings being reduced by half. So it just shows the amount of action that is needed to get up to kind of meeting that target. So we are quite a way off. The good news is that we've managed to reduce emissions quite significantly from our energy sector. So we've decarbonised our electricity supply and switched to renewables, which has been really positive. And that's largely been the contributing factor to that 50% since 1990. What we haven't seen is any significant reductions in the most polluting sectors currently, which are transport, agriculture and heating, which our speakers will be talking to you about today. And there have been delays to many key policies related to these sectors, which is why we haven't seen action. And alongside this, I probably don't need to let anyone know on the call about the impacts of climate change continuing to worsen over the last few years since the targets were set, and it being the countries that have done least to cause the crisis that are suffering the worst impacts. Other changes since the targets were set, just to note, has been kind of media and opposition party backlash towards climate policy. I think back in 2019, where the targets were set, there was generally thought to be a widespread public consensus around the need for action. But we have seen more polarisation and division amongst when policies have started to become announced, which also hasn't helped. But it's worth saying that recent research shows quite clearly that there is still very strong public support for climate action. And we can come on to that later in the session as well. So next slide, please, Joanna. Sorry, I may be having a little issue with the slides. There we go. Always some technical difficulties on these events. Sorry, bear with us just a moment. There we go. So hopefully you can all see this graph okay. This shows Scotland's progress in reducing emissions since 2008. So the black line from the top left corner shows the actual progress in reducing emissions. So you can see a fairly steep decline towards the kind of 2008, 2009 time, which is the electricity supply being decarbonised. And then you can see another quite steep decline around 2019, 2020, which was due to the COVID pandemic, when obviously there was a lot less transport and emissions from that. But then you can see the line starting to go up again, just in recent years, which shows emissions bouncing back after that. And what you can see with the yellow, I think they're triangles, that's the pathway we should be on to meet our 2030 target. So you can see there is quite a steep decline needed to reach that. And we are currently going up in the wrong direction. So there's obviously a lot of work to do to make sure we reverse that trend and get things in the right direction. Next slide, please. So there has been a lot of changes in recent months. So just to give you a quick summary of those. So following all of those missed targets, the government's advisors, the Climate Change Committee in April deemed, at the start of the year, deemed Scotland's 2030 target no longer credible. And this was due to kind of years of delay and inaction that I mentioned earlier on. So due to this, the Cabinet Secretary announced the Scottish Government's intention to remove the 2030 target and annual interim targets and switch to 5 yearly carbon budgets. It was in legislation that the government had to produce a climate change plan that set out how it was going to meet the targets. So if it couldn't do that, it would technically be breaking the law. And so they had to reopen the legislation to avoid breaking it. A lot of the blame initially was pinned on the UK government by the Scottish government. And it's no doubt that the UK government policy in recent years hasn't helped. The former UK government announced a series of backward measures, and also the financial situation has been very difficult. But it's really important to note that this is not the sole cause of failings. There are many devolved sectors, including transport, heating, and agriculture, that we're going to talk about later on, where there are lots of opportunities for action that haven't been taken. So following this announcement earlier this year, they started the process to change Scotland's climate targets in September, and they brought a new bill before Parliament, and that bill is actually due to pass today. So MSPs are going to be voting on that bill later this afternoon. Next slide, please. So just a very quick one on what a carbon budget system is, because that's the system we're going to be changing to from our annual targets. Just in summary, at the moment we have annual targets that we need to meet, and these are set by the Climate Change Committee. What will happen next year is the Climate Change Committee will advise on what those 5 yearly carbon budgets will be. So there'll be a number that we have to kind of average out over those 5 years. So we won't be able to see exactly every year what the rate is, but the Scottish Government have promised there should still be some way of assessing this progress. So we hope to have that, so we can don't have to wait 5 years to see how they're getting on. So we do have carbon budget system in both the UK and Wales. There are pros and cons to each, but just to note that the rates that we have to meet by 2030 will now be lower, so it will be a weakening of the ambition in Scotland. Next slide, please. I think this is my final slide. Oh, was there one before? Oh, maybe not. Okay, sorry. That's probably all from me then. But just to say, if you have any questions about the carbon budget system or climate targets or what's happened, please do put them in the chat and we can come to those after the speakers. But now I'm really pleased that we've got Claire Daly from WWF Scotland, who's going to be talking to us about one of these key sectors where emissions reductions are needed, which is heat. So over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Hi there, and thank you for that, Becky, and thanks for the introduction. I'm going to talk briefly about climate and heat. So your first question might be, sorry, if we can move on to the next slide, or can I move them myself? Can we go to the next slide, please? Excellent, thank you. You might be asking the question, why are WWF, Global Wildlife Charity, speaking about heat? Well, first of all, you don't need me to tell you that we are in a nature crisis and a climate crisis that affect each other. And here in Scotland, we've focused through our climate work on zoning in on heat. Heat, as you can see there, produces 20% of Scotland's climate emissions, and the figure has barely fallen since 2015. Another important point is that essentially Scotland's heating system needs to drastically change. 90% of homes in Scotland still have gas or oil boilers. Another point to make things worse is that 50% of Scotland's homes are failing to meet the Energy Performance Certificates standard level C, an EPC C rating. In other words, half our homes are too hard to heat, and most will need help to improve their performance and improve their insulation. Cleaner heating, on the plus side, I should say, just before we go on to that, fuel poverty is affecting 30% of Scotland's homes, and in some rural areas, and for example on the Western Isles, that figure goes up to almost 80%. On the plus side, cleaner heating can lower bills, can keep people healthier, and work towards tackling the climate crisis. If I can go to the next slide, please. We move to the next slide. Thank you.
I think it's a little bit slow, Claire. I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries, no worries. So, why is cleaner heat and why are heat pumps the way forward? Nothing is a panacea, of course, but we, having looked at this very, very carefully and done a lot of research and looking at the policy, we would say that electric heat pumps are the best way to tackle the climate crisis and the cost of living crisis when it comes to heating homes. How they work, and I'm not going into any technical detail on this, but essentially heat pumps concentrate the warmth in the air and almost work like a fridge in reverse. They're referred to as air source heat pumps. There's other types of heat pumps which draw up warmed from the ground, draw up warmed up air from the ground instead of from the air. Draw up warmth from the ground instead of from the air. And then you might ask, well, in Scotland we have a lot of people living in tenements and in apartments. So for some tenements, communal heat pumps systems are available. And a lot of people have said, oh, but district heating, heat networks as they're known, won't work in Scotland. How can they work in Scotland? Well, for example, in Denmark, 2/3 of houses get their heating and hot water from these kind of heat networks. So it can be done, it is being done. Heat pumps are extremely efficient. They actually produce 3 times as much energy as they use. And then coupled with insulation, they're likely to substantially lower your electricity bills, and especially if the UK government and Scottish government can sort out fuel prices that support low carbon energy. Heat pumps could cut your carbon footprint as well by up to 90%. So can I have the next slide, please?
Just give it a couple of minutes before it comes up.
No
Sorry.
worries. Well, I'm seeing questions pop up in the chat already, so and very good comments as well. So over to you, over to all of us. In WWF Scotland, and indeed with Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, what is it that we want from the Scottish Government? First and foremost, we want a strong heat in buildings bill. It was in the programme for government. We're waiting eagerly for the bill to be put before Parliament. We don't want any more dilution or delays or softening of targets in that if we are to meet our climate targets. And roll out clean heat at the pace and at the scale that we need to do that. Secondly, we want regulations to rapidly phase out the use of fossil fuel boilers and to require energy efficiency upgrades in homes. And this, must crucially include financial support for households, particularly those who need them the most, to help make those improvements. We want to see extended government grant schemes to help drive the new clean heat revolution. And very importantly for the sector, the business sector, this is the skills transfer. This is the change in how we deliver clean heat. This is the change in how we deliver heat. The industry is saying constantly, what we need is certainty. What we need is signalling of certainty and continuity. So we're calling on the government to expand and improve the low carbon heating sector. The heat pump industry needs to grow a lot, and it needs serious government backing to help it do so. We are talking about an energy transition. Here is a wonderful opportunity for a jobs transition. And this includes support for training new installers and engineers and retraining existing ones. So finally, the Scottish Government needs to work with the UK Government to bring down energy bills and indeed to reform the electricity market more generally. We think if that can happen, then we are on our way to cleaner heat. As they would say in Scotland, that's me.
Thanks very much for that, Claire. That's a brilliant overview of what's needed on heated buildings and touching on those other benefits that would bring as well. So that's a brilliant insight. Thank you. Without my notes in front of me, I think it's David next from Community Transport Association. Is that right? Let's go to the next slide.
Yeah,
Just
the
to say, if you
slides
have
are a
any
little bit
questions-
slow. So yeah,
No
for David
worries.
as well, if you wait a couple of minutes before the slide appears, because I feel like they appear on my screen before they're appearing for everyone. So thank you and apologies for that.
Okay.
No worries. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak to you all this afternoon. This morning. So I thought I would just start off by quickly on the next slide introducing what community transport is and what we do at the Community Transport Association, just for context. I am CTA Scotland Director, so we are a UK charity working across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. We have over 180 members in Scotland. We provide advice, information and support to those groups, which are all charities, community groups, social enterprises, which are part of the community transport movement, providing transport projects and services directly to communities. So if we could move to the next slide, you'll be able to see some examples of what that looks like in practice. Community solutions to transport problems. We have everything in the sector from community-owned buses to car clubs, minibuses, shared bikes, shared cars, all being done on a non-profit basis for a social purpose, and trying to plug the gaps in our transport system to make sure that everybody has access to local transport which meets their needs. And obviously within that, climate action and sustainability is a big priority and a big part of what we do. On the next slide, if we could move there, we have done research recently into what our sector is doing around climate action and how we feel community-led climate action is a big part of the route forward in transport. We feel it's not just about what we're asking government to do, although that is super important, and I'll come on to all of that in a second, but it's also about what we can do in communities, that it's not just waiting for someone else to give us permission, that communities can deliver solutions themselves. And if you want to check that out with our report, there's plenty of case studies to get you inspired and to give you some inspiration for what you might be able to do in your own community. And at CTA, we'd be very happy to support you going through that process of thinking about how to get it delivered in reality. On the next slide, please. These are graphics from our friends at Transform Scotland, reiterating some of what Becky mentioned at the start of the event. So we've seen basically no progress in reducing transport emissions over the last 30 years. And that's been particularly fueled by increases in the number of private cars on Scotland's roads. And on the right-hand side, you can see there that traffic levels are actually continuing to bounce back and increase after the first year of the pandemic, rather than reducing down to required levels to help us get to net zero. The Scottish Government has set a target of reducing car use by 20% by 2030, which is going to be really important to help us get there. But we've seen so far only some carrots and very few sticks to help us get there, and we need to see much faster progress, which is part of the picture on the next slide, which is a bit of a summary of why we're there, why we haven't made enough progress on transport so far, particularly in the last few months and years. We've seen slow progress on bus franchising, so different parts of Scotland are now looking at bringing local buses back under local control, introducing regulation on fares, reliability, frequency, to hopefully improve the affordability and the availability of local buses, which is the most important part of our public transport system in terms of numbers of passengers. But that is quite slow progress at the moment. For example, in Glasgow and the west of Scotland, we're looking at between 7 and 9 years until bus franchising is actually implemented, so that's a big concern. We've also seen cuts to active travel funding, including in the most recent Scottish Government announcements to Parliament. So that means less money for new cycle lanes and projects. We're seeing projects which are in the pipeline in different towns and cities being delayed, and that's going to have a big knock-on impact on whether we're able to get the number of people walking, wheeling and cycling up in the coming years. We've seen delays to the plan to reduce car use. So that target that I mentioned, there was a route map promised around that. All of the measures referred to as demand management, so trying to introduce disincentives and sticks to discourage people using their cars. That's been delayed. We're still expecting that to be published soon, but it seems as if some of the bigger, more radical ideas around congestion charging or road user charging might be kicked into the long grass as well. We've seen a big pot of money that was put aside for bus priority measures be cancelled. So that was going to fund things like bus lanes and gates to get the reliability and the speed of bus services increased, particularly in urban areas. But that money has been withdrawn, so that's been a big blow to making bus more attractive. We've also seen the end to off-peak rail fares, which was beginning to create some modal shift, so getting some people onto rail more frequently. And that's obviously in the midst of a cost of living crisis, so anything we can do to make rail more attractive by making it more affordable was a positive. We've also seen a failure to implement some historic promises. That should say back in 2019 that the Scottish Government promised to introduce motorway bus lanes, but we've still not seen any of those. And we're also seeing threats to local funding for local transport projects. So particularly at a local government level, where things like community transport rely on grants from councils, the pressures on their budgets due to really difficult national funding settlements is having a big knock-on impact and putting the survival of some of those projects at risk. So what do we want to see from the government? What asks do we have? If we could move on to the next slide, please. So We need to protect some of the gains that we have made, things like free bus travel for key groups of people. We need to see the acceleration of things like bus franchising, which really will give local and transport authorities the power they need to improve bus networks and make sure that they're run in the public interest, and to make sure that all of our communities are connected. We need, as I say, to make rail more affordable and also look at how we can expand the network. We've seen some of that in recent years, but it's been quite slow. So we need a bigger, faster, more predictable pipeline of expansion, as well as things like electrification. We need to see continued investment in community-led climate action. So more communities need to be given the resources and the opportunities to deliver shared bike and car schemes, to run their own bus services, maybe where a commercial operator isn't willing or able to do so. We also need to see a halt to new trunk road and motorway building. So we know that that is not only very expensive at a time when budgets are tight in the public sector, but that it is also inducing demand. So increasing the capacity for car use, encouraging more people to drive more often, which is the opposite of where we need to be going. And so all of that is to say that we need to see a much bigger and quicker shift of spending away from that which incentivizes or supports private car use towards prioritising active public, shared and community transport. And that's something that we need to see across UK, Scottish and local budgets. So it's critical that the decisions that Rachel Reeves makes, the decisions that Shona Robertson makes, and the decisions that local councillors are making are all pushing in the same direction and not cutting across each other to encourage people to shift away from private car use. And that's everything from me. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, David. It's quite stark to see the list of things that needs to happen, but also quite inspiring to hear about the communities that are taking on the action themselves as well. And I can see some things in the chat that have just been posted about some of the great campaigns that are happening on transport. So thank you very much for that. If you have got any questions for David, please put them in the chat and we can come to those after our final two speakers. So our next speaker is Andrew Midgley from RSPB Scotland, who's going to talk about agriculture and land use and the action we need to see there. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Becky, and good afternoon, everyone. As Becky said, I'm Andrew Midgley. I'm Senior Land Use Policy Officer in the RSPB. So my job is to try and advocate for changes in policy to get better outcomes for nature. And I focus on things like farming policy, uplands policy, all related into what sort of changes in land use are required. So I'm going to talk about agriculture and land use and as the sector where we need some action to reduce emissions. And I thought a place where I'd start was just with the latest data. So this graph that you can see, hopefully, shows you that this is the data, the most recent data is 2 years behind, is always 2 years behind. So the most recent data is for 2022, and it shows you that agriculture is the second largest source of emissions in Scotland. So that's a big deal in itself. But I also want to draw attention to land use emissions. So you'll see right across on the right-hand side a category LULUCF. That stands for land use change, and forestry. And that's actually slightly misleading. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. What I've done in this slide is take the same data, but that LULUCF category on the right-hand side includes some very big emissions and some very big removals. And so what you end up with is a very tiny figure. So it looks like the contribution of land use is small. But what we actually see when you separate out the emissions and the removals, you see that the emissions from land are huge. They're the biggest single source of emissions in Scotland. And then that's not including agriculture. So remember that the agriculture category over on the left-hand side, if you add that to the land use sources, you get somewhere in the region of more than 20 million tonnes of emissions from land use and agriculture. So I guess my point here is simply to emphasize that the way that we manage the land is critically important for us getting to net zero. And if we are to get to net zero, we have to think really critically, really quickly and think about a strategic approach to land use change so that we can try and reduce emissions. Just before I move on from this slide, just to explain that land use change category at the end there, the thing that above the line, the 14.8 bar there, that's mainly to do with peatlands. So we have a huge area of peatlands. About 20% of Scotland is covered in peat, and most of that is degraded in some way. And when a peatland is degraded, it releases carbon. And the green bar that goes below the line, that's primarily to do with woodland. And the reason I find it quite useful to separate these things out, instead of giving you a net figure, is just because there are lots of trees in Dumfries and Galloway, for example, and lots of other places as well, it doesn't mean that the emissions from peatlands aren't happening. And this allows us to see that. So we can see that emissions from land are actually really significant. Okay, next slide, please. So I've got two slides, one on land use and one on agriculture, and I just want to point out where we're at and where we're going, and broadly point out where what we need to do. So the first thing I want to talk about is peatlands. So I've already said they're a big source of emissions, and the most important thing to point out here is that we're really quite a long way behind where we should be. So a few years ago, the Climate Change Committee produced its proposal for how we should get to net zero. It's called its sixth carbon budget. And in that, it said that what we really need to be doing in Scotland is restoring in the order of 45,000 hectares of peatland per year. Now, the government in 2020 said that it was going to devote £250 million to restore 250,000 hectares by 2030. When you break that down, that was a 10-year period, and they were aiming at 25,000 hectares per year. And unfortunately, so far, we've only just last year managed to deliver 10,000 hectares of restoration a year. So from what the CCC thinks is the pathway we should be on, we're a long way behind. Now, to give government their due, there is a focus on peatland restoration. It's just not as comprehensive it should be and not as rapid as it should be. There is progress in this direction. It's just slow progress, and it really needs to be accelerated as a real step change is required. And that also relates to other land uses. So how do we make deer management contribute to this agenda? How do we change farming to contribute to this agenda so it's restoring peatlands? And what about upland sporting management? So there are lots of elements to restoring peatlands. The other part of land use, the biggest element of the land use agenda is to do with planting trees. So that's increasing the amount of sequestration, the sinks of carbon. So if we get talking about net zero, we need a big sink, otherwise we won't get to net zero. So we need to expand the amount of woodland that we have. And unfortunately, we seem to be heading in the wrong direction. So the government was ramping up its planting targets. So it was aiming to get woodland creation in the order of 18,000 hectares a year. But unfortunately, because of budgetary pressures last year, the forestry budget was cut in the order of something like 34 million, and that reduced the amount of money that was available for woodland creation. And now the government's aiming for about 10,000 hectares a year. So in the context of a climate emergency, when we need to see a big expansion of woodland, we're actually, rowing back slightly. So next slide, please. So the other column in that graph was to do with agriculture, and it's slightly misleading. The agriculture category isn't all the emissions to do with farming, because some of those are also in land use. But what's included in the agriculture category, mainly to do with methane emissions from cattle and sheep. There are emissions to do with the spreading of nitrogen fertilizer, to do with the spreading and storage of manure and slurry, to do with soil management, that's where, ploughing, that sort of thing, because that releases carbon, and the use of fuel within the agricultural industry. So those are where the emissions are coming from. And there are actions that can be taken across all of those. Now, the important thing to note here is that the government doesn't really want to venture into the realms of thinking about dietary change. So actually what it's trying to do is focus on improving the efficiency of the agricultural industry. And what that means is if there's a certain amount of emissions per kilo of meat, for example, it's trying to reduce that. And it can do that by trying to promote breeding of animals that emit less methane, for example, shortening the amount of time that an animal has between calving, or the life of the animal, because then it produces less methane. It can do things like improve slurry storage and so on. So the emphasis is on those things that doesn't change the industry from the structure it currently has too much, but makes it better and reduces its emissions. But the way that the government does that is primarily through incentive. So instead of just regulating, some countries are like imposing taxes on emissions and so on. In this country, what we're focusing on is changing the way that we provide money to farmers. So when we provide subsidies, we're trying to impose greater sort of rules associated with those so that emissions are reduced. But unfortunately, progress is slow. So the government is going to require all farmers to undertake a carbon audit. Now, that's a good thing, but the requirement is going to be that everyone will have had to have done one by 2028. And even having an audit doesn't necessarily mean that you then change anything. So it doesn't take us that much further forward. One of the big elements of the way the government spends the money is the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. It spends a tiny proportion of the budget on that, and that keeps getting cut. And the new systems that are being put in place are had big aspirations, but look like they're not heading in the right direction. So my message for the whole sector is agricultural land use are really important. We need to see a real transformation in the way that we use the land and the way that we produce food, but we're not really making great strides at the moment. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Andrew. Lots of important information there, and really great to have you with us, because I think the links between tackling climate and nature really need to be kind of brought out as well, and action to reduce emissions from agriculture and land use can also protect and restore nature. So yeah, really important to make those connections. Thank you very much for that. If you've got any questions for Andrew, please do pop them in the chat. We've just got our final speaker now, who is Lucy LaRue from Christian Aid Scotland, who's going to talk about international climate justice issues. So thank you very much, Lucy.
Thanks, Becky. Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm the Campaigns and Advocacy Coordinator for Christian Aid Scotland. We've heard a lot about domestic emissions reductions that need to happen in Scotland. And this is not just important for the people of Scotland, but also people all around the world. As we get close to the 1.5 degree temperature increase, we really need to see bold climate action from governments as they come together at the United Nations climate talks this year in Baku, in Azerbaijan. Increasingly, there are extreme weather events that are caused by climate change happening all over the world. For example, last week it was really heartbreaking to see the devastating floods in Spain. Can you go to the next slide, please? But for every instance of climate change that you hear closer to home, there are many that don't make the news. And as Becky said earlier, climate change affects all of us, but it's often the people in the countries that have done the least to cause the climate crisis that are paying the highest price. So one example of this is in Bangladesh. In August 2024, there was more than 188 millimeters of rain in just 3 days. That caused dams to burst and many regions of the country to be flooded. In the picture, you have someone from Aid Camilla, which is a Christian Aid partner, who is doing a needs assessment to work out who to help after that flooding. And that charity helped nearly 1,000 households with cash grants and provided hygiene and dignity kits. So if we move on to the next slide. So what do we need to see at COP29 for people around the world for there to be climate justice? Well, COP29 is focused on climate finance. There are 3 things that are being aimed for at this COP. The first one is a new goal for climate finance. This is because in 2009, wealthier countries pledged to mobilise £100 billion per year of climate finance by 2020. And some money has been provided, but not 100 billion. And now a new goal needs to be negotiated, but this is likely to be very difficult. There's a lot of debate happening about who should be contributing and how that goal would work. If you hear it mentioned, the technical term for this is the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. Also, many of you will know that Scotland has been very vocal about loss and damage in the past few years, and loss and damage is the climate change that can't be mitigated or adapted to. So it's the loss of life and livelihoods, it's damage to roads, to infrastructure, it's loss of cultural sites and other things. So in COP 27, which was a couple of years ago, the Loss and Damage Fund was established, and it was made operational in last year at COP28. But none of the $700 million that was pledged into that fund has yet to be distributed. And one of the things that Christian Aid and other organisations are pushing for this COP is that we want to see loss and damage to be included in the global finance goal, not just mitigation and adaptation. Finally, last year was the first time, believe it or not, that a transition away from fossil fuels was actually put into the wording that governments agreed at COP. But despite this, many countries, including in the UK and Scotland, continue to improve coal, oil and gas projects, which we obviously need to not happen if we're going to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. So next slide, please. So it's important that we tell our local politicians that we need to see action, not just for the people of Scotland, but for people around the world. And so, so here are some of the things that you can do. Firstly, we are running an event with Interfaith Scotland, the Quakers and others on the 16th of November. It's accessible to people of all faiths and none. It's a moment of reflection on the climate crisis, and we're going to do a silent vigil outside the Scottish Parliament to remember victims of the climate crisis. You can also ask one of your MSPs to support a motion which is going into the Scottish Parliament about COP29. And you can sign Global Justice Now's petition to the First Minister asking for the Scottish Government to support a fossil fuel treaty. And if you come to the next one of these, you'll actually hear Liz talking a lot more about that. And then finally, you can sign Christian Aid's petition to David Lammy, asking for the warm words that the Labour Party has said about climate action turning into actual action. And we have an information sheet which gives you points that you can write to an MP about. So that's me, but I think it's good to keep in perspective that we need domestic action, and we need this for everyone around the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that international perspective, Lucy. And I've just seen that there's lots of links going into the chat relating to those opportunities to take action that you just mentioned. So please do have a look at those links and support those events and campaigns if you can. Okay, so well, thank you to our four brilliant speakers. Thank you to Claire, David, Andrew and Lucy. We've got a bit of time for questions now, and I think there have been some coming up in the chat, and there has been some being answered as we go along. So Fiona, is there any questions that you'd like to pull out that we can direct to our speakers?
Sure. So yeah, I think the first question that we had was around budget. So it was how much budget has been set aside to support our ambitious targets? And if this is not sufficient, do we need to increase our taxes to pay for this?
Thanks for that, Fiona. I'm happy to just take that one quickly and then see if any of our speakers want to come in on that. So I think in the past, there hasn't been a strong enough connection between the financial budget and the targets that are the climate targets that are set. So obviously, unless commitments are made in the financial budget, policies won't be able to be delivered and action won't happen. So one of the things we've been calling for is for new funding to be raised in a fair way for climate action by making the biggest polluters pay. So an example of this is, you may have seen Oxfam have a new campaign around taxing private jets. So that's one way that we can target the real biggest polluters that currently aren't paying enough for the damage they're doing. And then we could redirect that money into things like cheaper, more reliable public transport. So that's just one example of how new funds could be raised. And then also we are still kind of funding the bad things, I guess. So at the UK level, there's still subsidies that go to fossil fuel companies who are making billions of pounds of profit. So it's about redirecting those things towards more climate-friendly policies as well. So the money is out there. The richer, who are bigger polluters, should pay more. And there's more on this on our website if anyone wants to have a look. Yeah, do any of our speakers want to come in on that finance aspect? I think there were things coming up about funding heat pumps. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Claire.
Yeah, sure. Well, again, at the moment, the Scottish Government is providing a subsidy of £7,000 for installation of a heat pump, or up to £9,000 in more remote rural areas. That is reflecting the fact that there are considerably more costs at the moment in terms of outlay for installing cleaner heat. But what we would hope over time, for example, is that the prices of those will come down. Another thing that's important in the Heat and Buildings Bill will be the obligation on landlords to install clean heat. And at present, there aren't subsidies for landlords to install clean heat. And I think that's an example of something that is fairer. I think there's a wider question, and this would be a personal view. This isn't an official view of WWF, but speaking more broadly as a climate interest and climate activist, there are some uncomfortable truths and thorns that we have to grasp with regard to paying and having fairer taxes, as you say. I think certainly there are areas of revenue raising that the government could be doing. There are many areas, for example, in transport. Road pricing would be something that this is not a WWF view, but I think from a wider environmental point of view, that is something that we need to consider. And there are just principles of those with the broadest shoulders should be able to support most. So I think what we need to be careful of course, is the narrative of the green taxes. These are an investment in our children's future and our society's future, and I think framing that in that kind of way, and they are future proofing. And I think if we want to speak the jargon of the business sector, I think talking about future proofing and not having stranded assets is something that kind of focuses the mind.
Great, thanks for that, Claire. That's really helpful. Keen to go to a few more questions then. Are there any others, Fiona, to share just now?
So there's lots of great comments and exchanges happening in the chat, but I think that might be all the questions that we had, unless I've missed some. So yeah, please do add any more that you might have.
I'll just go to the other speakers and just to check if they want to say anything on the financial aspects, because that is obviously a very big topic, and you've all mentioned things that need to be funded somehow. So I don't know if Andrew, Claire and Lucy, if you want to say anything about how these policies should be funded.
Well, just with the focus on agriculture and land use, I could just draw attention to the fact that the Scottish Government pays approximately 600 million a year to the farming industry. So, that adds up a lot over the years. And at the moment, the requirements for farmers to, the things that farmers are required to do in order to receive that support are really quite light. And the government is intending to change that. But there is a bigger opportunity here in that if we want to support our farming industry, and as an environment sector, we are advocating that we should be supporting our farming industry, we should be changing the rules and making this a vehicle to deliver much more for the environment, to deliver better outcomes for climate and nature. So there are sort of ways that we can tax people, there are ways that we can spend public money, and we can do that in the agriculture side of things is an example of the way that we can spend public money a bit more effectively to get better outcomes. So that's a long-term objective that we continue to work on.
Great, thanks for explaining that, Andrew. Lucy and David, do you want to make any final comments?
I'll maybe just jump in on the transport side then. I guess obviously completely agree with a lot of what Claire said there on the transport side. I think that the key issue is trying to increase the cost of the most destructive behaviours and then using the money that we can raise from that to subsidise the best behaviours for the climate, and recognising the massive co-benefits that are there for public health, for people's quality of life, for inclusion and accessibility. So for example, on low emission zones, I think as a country we got dragged into a conversation that wasn't really representative of the reality, people misunderstanding maybe or being misinformed about what low emission zones actually meant, thinking that it was something that would exclude people from city centres when actually it makes walking, wheeling and cycling safer and more attractive for everyone, and it was a measure that was going to benefit, for example, disabled people and not exclude them. And so we need to focus on that kind of messaging and on making sure that it's about fairness across the board, so that those who are currently unable to access private car use, for example, are not disadvantaged in the way that they currently are. And I think we're also currently spending a lot of taxpayer money on projects and services which are massively inefficient, and that doesn't get enough scrutiny. So for example, there's a very small section of the M8 going through Glasgow, which is being repaired at the moment at a cost of about £150 million, probably going to be more than that in the end. It's only really a few 100-yard stretch, but that's the cost of maintaining a large, frequently used urban motorway that slices through the heart of our city. And we're prepared to spend that on doing that. But at the same time, government is saying there's not enough money to continue, for example, the off-peak fares pilot on rail, which I think overall was costing about a third or less of that amount. So, clearly there are obviously differences maybe between capital funding and revenue funding, but that's just a general illustration, I think, of the fact that money is being found for certain purposes and not for others. So we need to be clear about that and hold government to account for that. And I think one way which would help for that is better transparency over budgeting. So it's actually really difficult to often scrutinise what government is spending money on, and particularly around key events like the budget. Anyone who's had the unfortunate pleasure of looking at the UK budget since it was published, for example, really, really tough to actually follow what's happening, and government could be a lot clearer about what we're spending money on, why we're spending money on it, to help us track, to the original question, how much of our national wealth we're actually spending on climate and how much we should be as well.
Great, thanks, David. Some really important points there. I'll just come to Lucy very quickly, and then we've just got a few minutes to share a few final thoughts with you all. So over to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you. Just quickly to say that in terms of international climate finance, it's very much about making polluters pay, as Becky was saying, and not taking money from like the already stretched public purse. Like Scotland has rapidly industrialised, has caused a huge amount of the pollution and climate change, and so it does have a responsibility to other countries around the world that are suffering devastating climate impacts. And the Scottish Government has done some good work in terms of loss and damage funding to places like Ethiopia and Malawi. So I'll put a link in the chat. Thanks.
That's well, Lucy. Thank you. Glad to see there's been some good dialogue back and forth, and thank you to our speakers again for their contributions in those discussions. I'm just going to spend the last couple of minutes just alerting you to some opportunities to take action. So hopefully this event has been a useful summary of some of the key issues that have been coming up over the last few months, some of the opportunities that are coming up. But I don't know if it's, can we have the last slide, Joanna, with the final information on some events and campaigns you can get involved with? Oh, it was there. There's been lots of links posted in the chat, so please do have a look at those. That will give you a lot more information. But just a few things that are coming up. So obviously COP29 does start next week, as Lucy said. So there's a few things that are happening around that. First of all, there's a court case around the Stop Rosebank oil field. There's been a campaign that's been running for the last few years, and it's a really critical moment in that case where it's going to the Supreme Court in Edinburgh. So there's going to be a rally outside the court from 8 till 9 a.m. next Tuesday. So please do come along to that if you can. There's also, as Lucy, I think, mentioned, there's a hand-in of the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign to the First Minister next Thursday, and everyone is welcome to come along. I think we're being asked to bring something red and join people there to hand in that campaign. So please do come along to that if you can. And I think the final slide just has a bit more information about the next 2 events in this series. So this is the first of 3 events about climate policy and climate action in Scotland. So the next one, we'll be hearing from some really inspiring campaigners about the action that they're taking and what you can do and how you can get involved. That's on the 20th of November. And then we've got one about how to speak to your MSP about climate. So tips about building a relationship and how to have meaningful conversations to encourage action from your MSP. I think we've got former MSP Claudia Beamish joining us for that. So that will be really helpful to get her views. So I think that is everything. Thank you very much for joining us. We will share a recording and all the notes, all the links and all the information after the session. But yeah, thanks very much to all our speakers and everyone who's come along. I hope you found it useful and hope to see you at one of the future events. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, just to remind you, you will receive a recording of this event and any useful links that you posted in the chat. So before you leave, if there's anything you would like to share with everyone, just post in the chat. Yeah, thank you.
You're okay to stop recording now, Joanna, thank you.
Oh, yes.